Joining me now is NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez. Raf, what's the latest on the newly released hostages? And obviously you've watched this unfold a few times now. So tell me what we are looking to see in the next hour.
Yeah, Ali, so we are 4 weeks into this fragile ceasefire. It is continuing to hold, as you said, 3 male hostages coming out today in exchange for 183 Palestinian prisoners. But there are big questions about how much longer this ceasefire can hold, especially in the Trump era. So let's start with the details of what happened this morning. We'll get on to the bigger picture. Ali, you and I have covered a couple of these exchanges together, and you'll remember in the early days, there was just unalloyed joy in Israel, especially as these young women were coming out. They appeared to be in physically good health. But today it was a darker picture. As you said, these 3 male hostages all appearing emaciated, appearing frail. They were able to walk, but they walked a little unsteadily as they mounted that stage put up by Hamas. And they are not all coming home to happy stories, Ali. So just to run through them. Eli Sharabi is 52 years old. He was taken from Kibbutz Be'eri. His wife and his 2 teenage daughters were killed on October 7th, and it is not clear that he knows that. It may very well be that he spends the first couple of minutes in freedom receiving the worst news of his life, that his family is dead. It's a similar story for Or Levy. He's 34 years old. He was kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival, and his wife was killed there. They have a little boy who is now 3 years old, and that boy has been without either of his parents since October 7th. It is a slightly more bright picture for Ohad Ben Ami, 56 years old. He was kidnapped along with his wife, Raz. She was released in that first prisoner exchange back in November 2023, and we are expecting them to be reunited at a Tel Aviv hospital in the coming hours. So these are darker stories, Ali. We don't have quite as much texture on those 183 Palestinian prisoners who were released, but just from some of the initial images, many of them are looking pretty frail, also looking skinny, and we are already hearing claims from them that they suffered torture at the hands of their Israeli prison authorities. Israel has consistently denied that it tortures Palestinian prisoners. So we are expecting in the next couple of hours those hostages will be flown to hospitals in the greater Tel Aviv area. They will be reunited with their families there. Those Palestinian prisoners, as you said, largely going back to Ramallah. But, Ali, we are hearing from the office of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that they intend to respond to what they are calling the grim scenes this morning. One, the fact that these hostages were forced to give these interviews on stage by their Hamas captors, and 2, just the terrible condition that they are in. But, Ali, there are also just big questions at this point when you have the President of the United States, the most powerful man on earth, talking about Israel continuing the war, defeating Hamas, and then handing Gaza over to the United States, expelling the 2 million Palestinian residents who have been through so much since October 7th. There are real questions about what incentives there would be for Hamas to continue these ceasefire negotiations, to try to move from phase 1 of the deal, which we're in right now, 6-week ceasefire, 33 Israeli hostages released, and move to phase 2, which would see a permanent end to the war, the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza in exchange for the release of all Israeli hostages. So those negotiations are underway in an initial phase right now in Qatar, but there is a lot of concern among the families of Israeli hostages, among civilians inside Gaza, and in the broader community about whether those negotiations are going to succeed and whether this ceasefire is going to continue or whether we are going to plunge back into fighting.
Breaking this morning, part of Donald Trump's plan to gut the federal workforce is now on pause. A federal judge has temporarily blocked the effort to place thousands of staffers from the U.S. Agency for International Development on leave, that's USAID. The Justice Department tried to justify Trump's gutting of the agency by saying the president, quote, decided there is corruption and fraud. But the judge noted no evidence of such fraud was provided in court. Meantime, crews have already removed USAID signage letter by letter from its headquarters in D.C. You're watching it right there on the screen. The future of the agency's humanitarian efforts are now in limbo. Joining us now is MSNBC political analyst and Republican strategist Susan Del Percio.
Good morning, Susan. I thought that Susan Glasser summed this up so perfectly in her New Yorker piece, noting, if cutting the federal government is what this is all about, then Trump and Musk would not be bothering with tiny USAID, whose estimated budget is less than 1% of the federal government's. The point is not a policy fight, it's an execution. They are killing one agency to terrify 1,000 others. Your thoughts?
Well, that's absolutely the case because it makes headlines. This is an agency which USAID does so much good around the world. But like a lot of government agencies, there are things that you can pick out and pull that thread and say, why are we funding something like this? And I think that's why they chose it to go after it. Plus, it was also something that matches Donald Trump's MO, which is if it's not about Americans, it's not good for us. So he's seeking to isolate us further and use this as really a way, Michael, to bluster and say what he's doing to cut spending. And as we know about Donald Trump, he just needs a fig leaf of something to say that he's done what he promised to do. Again, even when it comes to the deportations, we're not going to see millions and millions of people deported. But if he could get 50 people deported, he'll take credit.
He'll take credit. He will ruin lives in the process, and there are a lot of folks who will enable him as he does it. This headline from CBS News caught my eye. Some GOP officials say Trump administration's federal workers buyout program is illegal. The reason it caught my eye is because no one would go on the record with their name saying what he is doing is illegal. And I wonder what it will take for any of them to say with their full chest what you are trying to pull off at these agencies is illegal. And when they get to the point where they say, what are we doing here? If federal funding is supposed to be routed through Congress and you are just bypassing us, then why do I show up to the Capitol every week?
That's a great question. And for decades that I've been involved in government and politics, even the legislative side, even if it's split government, tends to work together to fight for their powers against the executive branch. It's not uncommon to see that. But what we're seeing now is that the Republicans in the House and Senate are willing to completely fold to Donald Trump's will. They're buying into he has a mandate. He doesn't have a mandate. He has the slimmest majorities possible in the House. He doesn't have 60 votes in the Senate, but they are afraid. I don't know how else to say it. They have no political courage. What does it take? Maybe 2026? Maybe. But I'm not putting any stock in that.
You mean a midterm where you have the voters hold them accountable?
Yeah, and then they become a little free once some of them get reelected, like a Susan Collins, for example. But at the end of the day, it troubles me so much to see that they are willing to abdicate the very thing that makes our country great. They are not willing to uphold the Constitution. They are not willing to live up to the oath they've taken. You can disagree with your Democrat counterparts, but at least fight for something. You're just simply abdicating everything, and especially in the House. And the House, I actually think they're happy they don't have to take a bad vote.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Susan, because in the House, I think that there's just a different calculation going on. I think about the fact that Speaker Johnson was one of the chief cheerleaders of Donald Trump during his, Stop the Steal movement. He was someone that, was on his podcast at the time talking about the fact that he was talking to the president every day at that point, challenging these ballots, right? He was a fringe character, and it's so interesting that now these fringe characters have become, now they're mainstream. Mike Johnson is now somebody that's like, oh, everybody likes him. He's a nice guy, and I'm sure he is a nice gentleman, and I'm sure many people do like him, but his ideas are quite fringe. He is aligned with the Christian nationalist movement. So that's what's happening in the House. But in the Senate, I was just really struck by Thom Tillis. Thom Tillis, senator from North Carolina, right, who is up for re-election in 2026. North Carolina, very interesting place. Some days it's purple, some days it's red. And Thom Tillis, way back when Hegseth wasn't yet confirmed, Thom Tillis went to John Thune, the leader of the Senate majority, the Senate Republicans, and said, we have the votes. And Thune told Tillis, you got to take that up with the White House. And to me, it's kind of like, what do members do, particularly Republicans, if when they do garner the wherewithal and the courage to go to the leadership doesn't back them? If I'm Tom Tillis, I guess it's like, well, I'm on an island. What do I do now? And obviously, he ended up voting for Pete Hegseth. But I just couldn't imagine a Mitch McConnell leaving his members out there like that, telling them to go it alone with the White House because I'm not going to have your back. What do these members do? What recourse do they have if the leadership is not going to stand up for them and with them?
Well, in the case of Tom Tillis, let's not forget the first place when it came to distributing disaster aid that President Trump went to. He went to North Carolina. And I just don't think those things can be separated when it comes to Tillis's vote for confirmation for candidates and the aid that was promised and the visit the president made there. The thing that is just so shocking about Tillis and others is that they should know by now Donald Trump will leave them on the side of the road. If there's someone else better to back in a primary, he has no loyalty to Tillis. So whatever these Republicans are doing, they have even Trump won't continue to back them. And you can't count on leadership if you're looking to back away from Trump, because Thune is also going to go along. Now, to be fair, let's not forget Mitch McConnell, when he was in leadership, really went along to get along absolutely with Donald Trump. So there's no question in that. But leadership seems to be just such a horrible word to use it. Maybe he's just like the herder of members, because there's no leadership being demonstrated in either the House or the Senate by the majority.
I think all of that is so right on point, Susan, and it kind of draws me to a point as an example, Marco Rubio at the State Department. I've always looked at Donald Trump selecting him as a way to punk the hell out of him. Because this is a guy, I'm going to tell you why, because this is a guy who has a core. I've known Marco a long time. And this is a guy who always, as particularly in the Senate, fought very openly about the democracy piece and how important it was for the U.S. to use its soft power through agencies like USAID, for the U.S. to be on the front lines of confronting the aggression of our enemies, like China economically and Russia militarily. And here he is now at the State Department. And what does he have to do? He has to do what Donald Trump tells him to do those things that go exactly counter to what he's always stood for. I give you the New York Times, in which it notes the Bureau worked on enacting policies aimed at pressuring China to relent on its forced labor of Uyghur Muslims. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has long been a champion of policies that advance human rights and promote democratic practices. In the Senate, Rubio was a lead sponsor of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which had broad support from both parties in Congress. But now, here he is firing 60 contractors working on those very issues. Those issues are no longer a priority because they aren't a priority for this president. What do you make of this? I call it the punking of Republicans by Trump to get them to do the things that they know they would never do otherwise.
Well, they should have known going in, Michael, that they were going to have to bend to Donald Trump's will every single time. They are not there to be to inform and to advise. They are there to carry out orders. Frankly, I think he nominated a cabinet to make him 25th Amendment proof, if anything should really go by. That's what I think it's all about. That's it. So that way he had everyone falling in line behind him. So any values or core sense of policy that Marco Rubio or anybody has that went to work for Donald Trump, they can no longer do it because you have to carry out the orders. What's so interesting when we see someone like Marco Rubio, and this is what concerns me, is that we're seeing norm breaking and it's just happening. So when it happens at the next agency, oh, well, Marco Rubio did it. It's all of these things that are going to become normal and just accepted after a few times around the track. And that goes to the functioning of our democracy.
Susan Del Percio, thank you so much, Susan. It's good to have you on this morning.
And joining me once again here in studio, Katie Phang, attorney and host of The Katie Phang Show. So here we go. Many of the president's actions of these last 3 weeks are facing legal hurdles.
As they should.
But many of them are merely temporary to pause them. So I'm curious if you can pinpoint any that are clearly unconstitutional or could lead to a constitutional crisis, as opponents are suggesting.
Okay, so I want to make it clear, I'm answering this question within the framework of the reality that we are in a constitutional crisis. And the reason why I say that is there is a brazen disregard for the law, as well as norms and institutions that have kind of created that safe space of our judicial system. And this has begun from the first administration of Trump. I call it Trump 1.0, and now we're in Trump 2.0. But one of the most layup easy answers for you is the birthright citizenship executive order that Trump has tried to force down the immigration throats of so many different people right now, and that several federal judges have told him you cannot do. And the reason why is it is blatantly unconstitutional. But we're also seeing judges that are saying to Trump and Elon Musk and people that are working for Elon Musk, what you are doing is not legal. And so there is a power in going to court. And that's why I want to remind people that they can get some reassurances that the legal system still works, because Trump lawyers show up to court. It's not like you have people like the attorneys general suing about the Treasury Department. And it's not like they're going to court and nobody shows up from the Department of Justice or nobody shows up on behalf of DOJ. That's not happening. So there are things that are transpiring in front of judges right now. There are orders that are being issued. The big question that all Americans have, including me, is, are they basically saying to hell with it? Are they looking at these documents and saying, this is what I think about your order, Judge? Because nobody is actually minding the till, meaning we're not having reports to these judges saying that you're having compliance with these orders. So I think the next step is judges need to make sure that these orders are being abided by. And if they're not, haul people like Trump and Scott Bessent and Elon Musk to court and say, why should you not be held in contempt of court?
But here's the thing. Is he testing Donald Trump? Is he testing his executive authority in the hopes that this ultimately makes its way up to the Supreme Court, and then he can invite or at least expect these conservative justices, 3 of whom he's placed on the bench, right, to support his rather unbridled view of executive power?
So he doesn't have to test his executive power anymore, because courtesy of SCOTUS, he's already been told he's a king. He's already been told that certain conduct that's done within the framework of his job in the executive office is protected conduct. And so that is why you see him saying, yes, maybe I want to push the envelope a little bit, Alex, when it comes to certain things like birthright citizenship, which we all take for granted because you look and you see it's an actual amendment in the Constitution. But he's already going and cloaked with the presumption that what he's done is legal and valid because the Supreme Court has told him that. So what is he doing? He's basically trying to create a fact pattern that he can make it to SCOTUS to see if SCOTUS basically says, you know what, it is okay to ignore the Constitution. And I think that is why you kind of see this throw the spaghetti against the wall, see what sticks theory. But you're also seeing that he's hitting significant roadblocks from the legal system, and they are stopping him. But again, it's one thing to say, here's the legal and here's the reality. And I'm more concerned about the reality. Are people actually listening to these court orders?
Give me just a second of Pam Bondi. Anything coming to light that she's done in her first few days as Attorney General that's making you go, whoop?
The fact that she's saying that she's basically going to be criminally investigating corporations for DEIA initiatives. You see Pam Bondi issuing directives that basically tell members of the DOJ and assistant United States attorneys, look, you work for us, so whatever we tell you is the policy, you have to do it, or else you're going to get fired. I mean, that's a level of this is my fiefdom. But the reality is, all of these are neutered people. Pam Bondi, all of them are neutered. What I mean is, they're truly impotent because their power is only derived from Donald Trump. They're not thinking independently, Alex. They're getting their orders, their marching orders from Donald Trump.
Gotcha. Katie Phang, thank you so much. All of you, we invite you to watch Katie on The Katie Phang Show. It's Saturdays at noon Eastern, right before this program here on MSNBC. Thank you, my friend. And joining me now is Defense One technology editor Patrick Tucker. Good to see you, Patrick. So USAID provides billions of dollars in humanitarian assistance to countries around the world. But you write, shutting down this agency will hurt U.S. interests and be a gift to China and Russia. And here's former USAID Administrator Samantha Power on how the attacks are being cheered by Moscow and Beijing. Take a listen to what she said.
They see the value of gaining this political capital and winning hearts and minds in this way. What we have seen is, prior to President Trump taking over, is attacks, sustained attacks by the PRC on USAID's reputation to try to denigrate the agency in the eyes of the publics in the countries in which USAID works. And since the dismantling of USAID began a couple weeks ago, we have seen the PRC relish the strategic opening that this offers them.
So can you explain how shutting down the foreign aid agency then plays into China and Russia's hands?
Sure. Well, where do you want to start? Anywhere around the world. If we take a little bit of a brief tour in Ukraine, USAID provides not only critical medical aid, which does get its way to frontline soldiers because all of Ukraine is a battlefield. USAID support was instrumental in helping them stand up a power structure to keep the lights on. Energy resilience. It also allowed them to rebuild a digital economy, really important for their continued economic growth, to keep the government basically run and funding and funding frontline workers. Let's go to Moldova. In Moldova, documented Russian interference efforts targeting election. USAID was there providing cybersecurity and critical attribution of Russian election interference methods. Let's go to Africa, where the U.S. operates continuously against ISIS targets and other terrorism threats. There, the U.S. was operating out of a base in Niger until last year. Why? The Nigerian new government that took over in a coup kicked them out. What supported that? Russian disinformation efforts. USAID supports independent journalism all across these places to highlight some of those interference efforts. Let's go to Latin and South America, where, again, the People's Republic of China is attempting to curry influence, corrupt public institutions, corrupt public officials in order to decimate U.S. influence in the region. USAID supports independent journalism and fact-finding that reveals those efforts to the people of those countries. So there's really not a part of the globe that you can look at and pick where USAID isn't having an effect that is direct to national security, and that is what Chinese and Russian Kremlin and PRC media outlets are today so excited about.
So, and you haven't even touched all the topics. Let me go to malaria and tuberculosis outbreaks, medicines for 500,000 children living with HIV, a bird flu outbreak happening right now in at least 49 countries. These are just some of the global health emergencies USAID works to combat. What are the real-world consequences of shuttering this agency, Patrick?
Well, yes, just in terms of medical health. The short-term effects, interruption of important medical services, AIDS relief in all sorts of places, halted disease prevention initiatives, halted food security challenges, initiatives to deal with food security challenges, long-term effects, potential resurgence of infectious diseases in places where we had thought that we had turned the table on those. And those will eventually affect the United States population in one way or another, because we are in a globalized world right now. People travel very freely. And so there's not an infectious disease outbreak that's not going to have an effect on the American population. There's also the long-term effect of the deterioration of health infrastructure, hospitals, disease monitoring all over the world. USAID plays a critical role in that. So there's some short-term terrible effects, and there's some long-term terrible health effects.
So you have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who said the U.S. is going to continue to provide foreign aid, but only if it aligns with our national interest. What are some examples of that? Let's leave healthcare aside. We all learned during the COVID pandemic that it's not like, oh, it stops at a state line or some international border.
Right. Yes, Secretary Rubio was not particularly specific about exactly which of USAID's funding or programs is not in U.S. national interests. But he also said that different program managers can apply for waivers, emergency waivers, to have their funding restored. As you pointed out, and as others have pointed out, that decimated staff, 10,000 down to about 611 operationally. I've talked to some of them, and they don't have the means or the capacity to write all of the waivers that need to be written, and there's not a clear process for doing that. So it's unclear at this point how that would happen. But really importantly, if you look back to what Senator Rubio said about USAID, if you look back to what Senator Lindsey Graham and other U.S. lawmakers were saying about USAID just before this, and what senior military commanders have said about it, you will find universal universal support, gratitude, and appreciation for their work. So it's a sudden and dramatic reversal of tone instigated by political events and, I guess, certain people's vendettas.
Let me just remind folks that both Melania Trump and Ivanka Trump worked with USAID.
On Monday, I was sitting in my office and, heard sobbing, and I looked around and it was people who had just gotten an email. I mean, civil servants who had worked for decades, across administrations that had received an email saying that you're on administrative leave effective immediately. And at the time, I thought it was just those people in my sitting space. And we didn't find out until that night from a Politico article that it was 60 civil servants that had just been, put on administrative leave, and I heard that at least one of them was walked out of the building. I can't speak for every single one of them, and we were finding out who it was based on hearsay from other colleagues that were also saying, oh, this person isn't here today, but they were here yesterday. So that was Monday, and then throughout the week it just continued to feel really heavy. And all throughout the week, again, as I'm sure you've heard, contractors were being furloughed right and left. And you didn't know who and what and when until you saw them post on LinkedIn saying they were open for work. And then, as has happened on Saturday morning, all the websites went completely blank. And then I tried to log in Saturday, probably around 7 p.m., and my access was completely revoked. And there was no information about this, no emails, I had a meeting scheduled at 11 a.m. with the new acting administrator to do work. And then our access was completely revoked. So I couldn't retrieve any emails, I couldn't retrieve any communication, I couldn't retrieve any old speeches for writing samples. You lost complete access. And then we were told not to come to work on Monday through an email that I didn't receive because I didn't have access. So
how did you find out about it?
I found out about it from colleagues who still had access, which there was no pattern to who did and did not. And they texted and said, hey, they're saying that the building is closed.
There's the swiftness with which this has all happened, but it also sounds so chaotic.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's word of mouth. Your livelihood and the work of this massive agency is completely, the agenda here is not developed.
Yeah.
And the execution is completely scattershot.
That's the way it feels. I think that I can confidently say at no point in the past 2 weeks did I receive any indication of my employment status or lack thereof over the past weekend when we lost complete access in ways that, I think that as a worker, you should be, entitled to picking your things up and retrieving your files and your communications. No knowledge of that. And even as a contractor, most of USAID is contracted. My contractor had no idea. My contractor said, we have no idea what's going on. You should contact people there. And I said, I can't contact people there. And then they said to work from home, and our contractors still have no idea.
I mean, these are people all over the world.
Yeah, I would say that I think the estimated loss in American jobs alone from what I would consider bringing the development sector to its knees is 52,000 jobs.
Wow.
More than that around the world, because we have implementing partners and these massive implementing partners, 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 employees that are doing amazing work around the world. Again, employing Americans and others they've all been furloughed because they can't, they are not getting paid. They can't pay their own bills. So in addition to the USAID folks that are losing their jobs without being able to plan or even put in 2 weeks, everyone in the development sector that I know is just sitting here going, what do we do? What's next? How do we continue to help the people we're helping? Because ultimately, I'm probably losing my job. Most people here have. And what we really care most about is the people we're serving. And we also have no communication with them because we can't communicate with our liaisons through our systems. We can't retrieve anything. And again, it's word of mouth. So they might not know that we're engaging. So everyone is very confused, very slipshod, and very chaotic. People forget that something like USAID is a critical tool in America's national security toolbox. The more we invest in these things like development, the more we're investing not only in the health and security and human dignity of people around the world, but you're also building, currency with countries around the world, and you're also protecting truly the safety of the American people. So it's devastating, truly, to see that this is not only being dismantled, but there might not be an alternative.
What's the emotional tenor of the conversations you've been having with current, I don't know, former USAID employees? What's that like?
These people are public servants who never ask for recognition. They never ask for, you know, anything except that they do a good job for people around the world, and they see that every single day. We functionally see that every single day. And what hurts the most is when you think about those people in the field that are no longer getting this life-saving care, this life-saving food, these life-saving shelter, maybe the fear too that we're abandoning them, and it's not our choice to do that. And we, I think, hold honor and dignity and trust to a very, very high standard here at USAID. It's part of the culture and the mission. So to feel like that's been broken without your input is something that is just so incredibly heavy. I think it's a profound sadness that cuts deep and is compounded by the fact that most of these people are also looking for their own livelihood now. And that, I mean, there are people crying in the hallways, and there's this sense of you cry in the elevator because if they see you crying out of it, they know where you stand, and that's really heavy.
We're sitting here in Washington, and it feels like, to some degree, a slow motion coup is underway, right? Like, if you were launching a soft coup, you'd go in there, you'd storm the gates, you'd take over buildings that weren't ones that you necessarily had access to before, you'd start firing people en masse, you'd institute loyalty tests, you'd replace top leadership. I mean, all those things are happening.
I think that this place represents truly like the best of the American people, and it represents the empathy that I know we have. It represents the kindness and the gratitude and the respect for human dignity that we have, and I believe that we are all of this place. We are all of those values.